What's new and newsworthy? Get some of the latest information about addiction recovery research. Years ago, I kept trying to convince Dr. Clark that the best way to have any kind of research is to put a chip in the ear and track people as they come into Oxford House and leave Oxford House. Dr. Clark was then director of CSAT and used to suggest that my attitude was a bit of Republican conservatism and not very American. Hear, hear. However, today, as years have passed, I have a thing on my wrist called a Fitbit that keeps track of every step I take. I look at people at this convention and I see lots of piercing and other things, ears, everywhere else. It seems to me at some point we need to really become a tracking mechanism for folks who do research so that people will know exactly what happens if you move into an Oxford House, get involved in the democracy of a house, learn the kind of self-reliance and self-respect that comes from Oxford House living, and you'll probably stay clean and sober forever. Now, having said all that, this session has some wonderful experts, from Stu Gitlow, Dr. Clark, Kevin Sabat, Will Compton, John Kelly, Josh Saberstein. Josh used to be in the Energy and Commerce Committee way back in the days that I was up there. He was called Waxman's man. And we Republicans used to figure out how we're going to change what they want. We never succeeded very much. And fortunately, he was responsible for helping us get expansion because of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988. Okay, with that, let me turn it over to the moderator, and John Kelly, keep this panel going.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. Hi, everybody. My name's John Kelly, and many of you probably saw me on the last talk, but if you didn't, I'm a researcher and clinician from Mass General Hospital and Harvard Medical School in Boston. I'm very happy to be here. So Paul has tasked me with the moderator role this morning. I will chime in as well when I feel appropriate. But we've got such a top expert panel here. I'm just honored to be up here on the stage with all these fantastic experts in the field of addiction. So what I thought we'd do to begin with, and I want to get your questions. I think, you know, in many ways that's what I think we all want to get, is what's on your mind, what your questions are. So I want to make sure we leave enough time to get plenty of your thoughts and questions about what's going on and what we need to do more research on, and the pressing issues that you're facing. But what I have suggested to the panel to begin with is for each panel member to come up and talk for 5 to 7 minutes and tell you who they are and give 1 or 2 new and newsworthy tidbits on research in addiction and what's new. So why don't we, any volunteers to start? Wilson bravely has volunteered. Thank you, Wilson.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Wilson Compton. I'm the Deputy Director at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. National Institute on Drug Abuse is known as NIDA. We're the folks that do all sorts of research related to drug abuse and drug addiction. So we're the ones that explore how drugs affect the brain. And perhaps most relevant to this group, we look at how recovery is reflected in brain recovery itself. We've also done a lot of research to look at how Oxford House has impacted lives of so many people. We funded the work by Lenny Jason and colleagues to show that help demonstrate how effective Oxford House can be in supporting people's lives and allowing them to enter recovery for the long term. That's really what this is all about, is how do we help people not just save their lives, but turn their lives around and really change their lives in the long haul. That's what we all hope, and that's what our research is all about, both preventing those trajectories and then what can we do to help people exit these devastating conditions. Now, I have just a couple of things to share with you this morning after those introductory remarks. First off, I want to remind us that Oxford House is all about housing, and housing is essential to recovery. I was really struck when our director, Dr. Nora Volkov, visited a series of treatment programs in Baltimore recently. And in discussions with the people in treatment, one of the main issues they brought up was how difficult it was to recover without stable housing that provided support for their changing their lives. Most people end up going back to the communities where they came from, where the same risks and problems exist for them. Oxford House can provide a respite from that and a place to really turn your lives around in a safe environment. In addition to the sort of very practical issues of just having a place to live is not a given for many people who are early in recovery and beginning to make that transition. So that's number one. Housing is essential to the recovery process. It's something we know from all of you and we know from much of our research. Second, to address the opioid crisis, and that's really been what has been the focus of my attention for these last, actually more than a few years, but we've had extra funding and support to do additional research in this area recently. We see recovery support as key to these issues. So for instance, we're doing work on how do we engage recovery support personnel in screening and brief intervention. We want our primary care doctors to ask patients about, hey, are you using substances? Which substances are you using? And if you have a problem, how can I get you into treatment? Well, guess what? It's not just the doctor or the nurses or the healthcare practitioners doing that. It's when they engage with the recovery support that it looks the most promising. So that's some of the models we're trying to study is how can we engage recovery and peer support in those healthcare settings to help people make that transition? Because people do show up in healthcare and they often aren't quite ready for that transition. So peer support can make a difference in moving people along that trajectory. We also know that helping people enter recovery when they've overdosed is a key challenge. I kind of thought, in my naive way, that when you overdose and we rescue you with naloxone, because we're so grateful to have a medication that can save people's lives when they have overdosed, that people would want recovery at that moment. They'd want to enter treatment because they've just nearly died. No, it turns out most people in that setting mostly are thinking, oh my God, I've woken up, now I'm in withdrawal, what I want to do is go back and get high. The next day, there may be an opportunity to reach out to them. So that's what some of our researchers are doing now, is figuring out, can we use peer support to reach out the next day or the day after when people may be ready and willing to hear the message about the value of recovery and the opportunities for turning their lives around through programs like Oxford House and many of the treatment programs we have. All right, so that's number two, the importance of engaging recovery in our research enterprise addressing the opioid crisis right now. The third is a specific research study that I read about recently that looked at what happens long-term when we started people on medication. We did a study not too long ago to look at, can we use buprenorphine to help people who are recovering from prescription opioid addiction? And the answer was yes, that short-term wasn't as good as longer-term. But our researchers did some long-term follow-up, looking, well, like 4 years later, how are people doing? What predicts people being abstinent and still being in recovery 4 years later? Well, the number one predictor was those people who were still on medications. That didn't shock me. I know that medications can be very helpful for people that are struggling with opioid use disorder, with opioid addiction. But what was really important in this study was the number two predictor was engagement in 12-step recovery programs. And it turned out that these things weren't sort of mutually exclusive. What I mean by that is, it doesn't mean that medications help some, recovery support helped others. The combination of the two was essential. So they added to one another. They didn't defeat one another, but by adding these two together, we can actually have a bigger impact. I think that lesson is super important for the field and ignored by way too many people. So the last thing I want to leave you with is, I need your help. I've identified a couple of key questions that I think are important for recovery research. Can we use peer support in engaging persons who are in the healthcare system? Can we use peer support to help people who have recently had an overdose? But I bet there are a lot of questions you all have that need to be answered. I don't know, are the Oxford houses using Narcan? Are there Narcan devices in Oxford houses? I see a bunch of nodding heads, and I'm really pleased that even if it's not for the people in the house, guess what? You're gonna know a lot of people out in the community, and you'll run into people who need their lives saved. Because I can't do recovery management and recovery support on a deceased person. But we certainly can when people have their lives saved. We have the opportunity to help them turn their lives around. But I'd love to hear your ideas for research ideas that we can help support. That's what I do at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. We fund people like Dr. Kelly and others to do research all across the country, and we want your ideas for what should be supported. I'm not sure whether I'm allowed to take questions now. I think we're all supposed to speak, and then we'll definitely turn to you for some observations. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Terrific. Thanks, Wilson. Just one thing I forgot to mention is that Dr. Jerome Adams, who is the U.S. Surgeon General, is going to be joining us, we hope, at around 10:30, I believe, so we can look forward to that. That should be in about 30 minutes. So when he comes in, we'll have him also give, again, a 5 to 7 minute introduction and talk a little bit in the same way. Okay, who wants to go next? Stuart? Thanks.
Good morning. My name's Stu Gitlow. I am in Rhode Island. I have a private practice there in addictions. And what I'd like to focus on is the importance of recovery. And the important thing within recovery is that it's not useful unless you're alive to experience it. The number one leading cause of death among patients in recovery is smoking. Nobody thinks of that. And I'll come to these meetings thinking we're being successful when I can get into the hotel without coming through a cloud of smoke and vapor, which at this point I can't do. So if we're going to get to the point where you all can experience recovery for as long as you possibly can, we're going to address smoking. And we've got to start looking at that as being a key issue among folks in recovery without talking about heroin, without talking about cocaine, without talking about marijuana, and looking at the number one leading cause of mortality, right? We're here in the middle of what the New York Times and all the newspapers address as being the opioid crisis. We lost somewhere between 70 and 80,000 people last year as a result of opioids. Seems like a lot, except we lost 500,000 due to smoking last year. Now, we've lost about 500,000 people a year due to smoking each year for the past 5, 10, 15 years. So it's not news. And because it's not news, because the same thing happens year after year, we're essentially having this experience where 747s full of people crash every day around us, and the news is about the small car crash taking place across town. And that's the leading story, right? We've got to focus on the 747s. Apologies to Boeing for the example. The key here is to look at where the deaths are actually taking place. Number two, behind cigarette smoking and behind vaping and behind e-smoking is alcohol, still the second leading cause of death among folks with addictive disease. So opioids are way in the background. What we need to focus on still is tobacco and alcohol. Tobacco and alcohol, tobacco and alcohol. I cannot say that enough because that's the key to solving the problem of the mortality rate that we have associated with addictive disease. All right, having said that, since you all expect me to say something about opiates, let's say something about it. The rate of death among people with opioid use disorder is about 15 times higher than it is in the general population, meaning that I have an expectation among folks coming into my office who have opioid use disorder that they're going to die pretty quickly. What can I do in order to stop that or at least slow it down? My expectation is that in individuals with opioid use disorder, if I have 100 patients and all I do is say hi and smile at them and send them off to 12-step meetings, about 5 of them are going to die every year. So of every 100, I'm going to lose 5 per year if I only use psychotherapy plus 12-step. If I add medication to that, I save 4 people per year out of those 100, right? Because the number of deaths goes from 5 per 100 to 1 per 100 on medication, whether it's buprenorphine or methadone. For either one of those, I save 4 out of 100 people per year. Now, then comes the question, and here's the new research. The question is, how long do we keep them on medication? The answer? Forever, right? This is an antihypertensive for people with hypertensive disease. This is insulin for people with diabetes. Don't come off it, because if you come off it, even years later, the mortality rate rises from 1 per 100 to about 1.7 per 100. I almost double the death rate by taking somebody off buprenorphine or methadone. So there's no point in taking them off it unless the only reason for wanting to come off it is, I don't want to be on it anymore. No, that's a terrible reason. I don't want to be on it anymore. Well, I don't want to be on an antihypertensive anymore, and my diabetic patients don't want to be on the insulin anymore. Tough. Suck it up. Keep taking the medication, because that's going to make it less likely that you die. That's a pretty good reason in my book. So the bottom line for this is take the medication and then do everything else that you need to do in order to have a good recovery. Quit smoking would be number 1. Number 2, go to AA or NA meetings. Work the program, do the steps, talk to everybody else in the room. But the key to all of this is to take care of yourself. And the ways of doing that are the same as they are for everybody. If you've got a chronic disease state, take the medication that's the right one for your chronic disease state. And if your chronic disease state involves, as it does here, a certain way of thinking, then work that through on a daily basis. Focus on it. And everybody here in this room is doing that second piece. Do the first piece, take care of yourself, in addition to taking care of yourself spiritually. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Stu. And Kevin, you volunteered next. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much. My name's Kevin Sabet. I was a senior policy advisor in the Obama administration for 2.5 years in the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and before that, for a time in the Bush administration, when it was okay to be bipartisan, which I hope we can bring those days back. I don't know what you think, but I miss those days. I miss those days a lot. I also want to commend you all for being here, because one of my mentors, Bob DuPont, talks about the Oxford House program and 12 Steps also as really a modern miracle. And it may not be popular on Twitter, and if you're on Twitter and you look at and see what people say about especially 12-step programs, it's not very popular. But there's been this very insidious thing that I call a false dichotomy between 12 steps and medication-assisted treatment, as if they're completely incompatible. And we know there are many paths to recovery. We know that they are compatible. And we want to have a large enough tent to keep people alive and bring everyone in the fold. But you all are the living examples of why us people up here, and it's an honor to be really up here with giants of the field. I'm humbled to be up here, although it looks more like a mantle than a panel. But I think we'll change that next time. We have some great women that next time can be up here. Obviously, Dr. Nora Volkow, probably the world's leading authority on addiction. People like Dr. Eden Evans, Dr. Sion Harris, on and on and on, that we want to incorporate for next time. But I want to go further with this idea of a false dichotomy, because from where I'm coming from, and it comes off of what Stu just said, I can't believe that we look around, we look at the addiction for profit industry that sadly our country is so good at doing. We look at the alcohol industry. 90,000 people killed a year. Every dollar in alcohol tax costs us almost 20 in social costs. More people in the criminal justice system today for alcohol-related offenses than marijuana and all other illegal drugs combined. Are we having fun yet? And yet alcohol taxes are a fifth of what they were than during the Korean War. Why? Because we have a massive industry with great lobbyists that sadly have a lot more money than Oxford House or other recovery groups and are laughing all the way to the bank. Then we look at one of our other favorite industries, the opioid industry, right? The Sacklers have generously said that they would give, I guess, $10 billion, which is probably a tenth or a hundredth of their wealth, to get people off their back for the OxyContin mess and the mess from Purdue Pharma and the opioid industry. But that industry, don't worry, they're still making a ton of money even after the Johnson & Johnson lawsuit. And we're 50, 40,000 people dead a year from opioids alone from that addiction for profit business. And then we look at the biggest one that Stu mentioned, which is by far the biggest one, the 747. We look at the tobacco industry, right? 450,000 people dead a year for the past 50 years, an industry that lied to the American people for almost a century, that said in 1999 that tobacco wasn't addictive. They said that in 1999, not 1899, 1999. And if you know about the history of tobacco, tobacco didn't kill many people until about 100 years ago, until about 50 to 100 years ago. That's when the lung cancer incidents happened, when big tobacco took over what was before kind of an occasional thing that would use in a pipe, did not have all the additives in it. But big tobacco came and took a plant, tobacco, that had been used for thousands of years by many cultures. And it was kind of an irritant, but it wasn't killing the number of people it kills today worldwide. Big tobacco took that and turned it into the deadliest weapon that mankind has ever produced. And now I look around and I wake up and I look at the one that's about to be the fourth one, our friend marijuana. Right? And that's right. And we look at, and that's what I'm concerned about. I founded a group called SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, with former Congressman Patrick Kennedy, not because I thought marijuana was killing more people than tobacco, but because there was kind of no one else doing it. And I saw a couple of years ago this addiction for profit industry starting up again for marijuana, taking what's called just a plant, and by the way, poison ivy is just a plant too, so don't think that just a plant means it's okay. There are a lot of plants you don't want to ingest, including hemlock and a lot of other things, right? But we see the marijuana plant being used for a long time, but now we see an industry around it. And we see an industry around...
He's right.
Thank you, Surgeon General Jerome Adams. Let's thank him, actually, for his leadership. I'm going to shut up in a minute because I can go on all day about this because we were really here to see and hear General Adams, and I do want to talk about the great work he did yesterday, which was the most significant policy development in marijuana from the Surgeon General's office almost in my lifetime, in about 38 years, about 2 or 3 years shy of my lifetime, since 1982. And what happened yesterday was historic. But I just want to finish this thread, and then I want to introduce the Surgeon General. An industry that took a plant and basically is now modifying it to its benefit, that relies on addiction for profit, just like the industries we just talked about, tobacco, alcohol, and pharmaceuticals. And what happens when an industry takes over something is that more people die. Folks, more people are dying from tobacco and alcohol than heroin, not because tobacco is more harmful than heroin 1-to-1, right? If you had a gun to your head and you were given a cigarette or a vial of heroin, I'd probably smoke the cigarette if I had to choose one, right? But to society, tobacco is much more harmful than heroin, because it kills 10 times as many people, it costs 10 times as much money in social costs. So when an industry takes over and produces what we see the marijuana industry is producing today, 99% concentrates, 70% concentrated gummy bears, chocolates, cookies, candies, sodas, we think that's for the occasional adult user. Folks, we've heard that story before. We've heard it before with the candy cigarettes. We've heard it before with the Alco Pops. We've heard it before with the formulated opioids that were only supposed to be for people with very, very severe pain in the hospital, but in reality, the average person was getting 350 pills every time they went to the pharmacy. Folks, we've heard this before because this is what our sad history of our country is, what we call the addiction for profit industry. And so I do not want people to go to prison for marijuana. Let me be very clear. I don't want to saddle someone with a criminal record for making a mistake and they couldn't hire a good lawyer, and because of the color of their skin, they got caught up in the criminal justice system. But to tell me that the answer to that systemic, big problem is to commercialize a new substance, of which, by the way, the research that we talk about when we talk about the harms of marijuana, psychosis, mental illness, schizophrenia, reduction in IQ, that's done on marijuana that was 10% or less potent. Folks, we're only beginning to find out what the 99% potent stuff actually does. And when I look at society today and I see that there are 10 times more daily users of marijuana in this country among Americans 12 and older. There are 9 million today. There were 900,000 in 1992. I see a new industry that is laughing all the way to the bank and pretending to be social justice advocates, while in reality, the big secret is the pot industry is basically 99% white, rich, coming from corporate America, trying to get rich again. I ask all of you to look into who is behind the marijuana industry. You do the research yourself. You're going to find some familiar players. You're going to find some people like Philip Morris Altria. You're going to find the largest alcohol industry conglomerate, Constellation Brands, involved. You're going to find them all involved because this is their new product line. So it may be déclassé, it may not be cool to talk about marijuana right now in the midst of the opioid crisis, in the midst of stimulants, which is a huge issue coming back now. And in our country, every time we've had an opioid crisis, it's been followed by a stimulant crisis. And you look at the numbers with methamphetamine in rural America and with cocaine around the country, and it's scary. It's looking like what the opioid crisis looked like in the early 2000s when we were getting the precursor. So I'm a little worried about that, very worried about the stimulants as well. But let's not take our eye off this benign plant that is not a plant, that has been genetically bred to be a lot more harmful. And I'll leave you with this. I had someone tell me the other day that marijuana wasn't addictive, and I asked them how they knew that. Why do you think marijuana is not addictive? And as a 16-year-old, he said, Kevin, I know marijuana is not addictive because I use it every single day. So folks, that is the misinformation that we're led with. So I want to introduce the Surgeon General, and I want to thank General Adams for the leadership that he and his Department of HHS, the Secretary Azar, did yesterday by issuing, and he's going to talk about it, the first Surgeon General advisory on marijuana since 1982 to warn Americans, especially pregnant women and young people, but really all Americans, that this is a growing problem, and we may not have the industry influence and the lobbyists, which they have tons of, but we have truth, we have history. In the long arc of history, they're going to say, what were they thinking? Pot gummy bears. What were they thinking? 99% potency. Just like I say to my parents, smoking on airplanes, what were you thinking? Smoking at the hospital, what were you thinking? Doctors smoking, doctors selling it, advertising it, what was your generation, the baby boomers, what in the world were you thinking? Our kids and grandkids are going to say the same thing to us. Surgeon General.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to come in and address all of you. I can't tell you how honored I am to be here in front of each and every one of you, and I'm going to tell you a little bit of why I'm honored. But first, I got to tell you, Kevin gave me a promotion. I'm neither a surgeon nor a general. I'm actually an anesthesiologist trained in acute and chronic pain management. 25 years ago, when I was in medical school, they told me opioids were non-addictive. They told me they were safe. They told me I was a bad doctor if I didn't prescribe them. So I've lived through this. I've seen this evolve over the years. And as Kevin mentioned, I don't want us to have the same play all over again when it comes to other dangerous substances. So I'm not a surgeon. I'm an anesthesiologist. I'm also not a general. I'm a Vice Admiral in the United States Public Health Service Commission Corps. Thank you. Thank you. And Rolling Stone yesterday identified me as the Attorney General. I'm not the Attorney General either. If you all have questions for him, please do not give them to me. Please do not give them to me. Surgeon General, not Attorney General. But, my most important accolade isn't my MD, my MPH, my Vice Admiral, it's DAD. I'm a dad of a 15, a 13, and a 9-year-old. And any of you well, thank you for that. Because for the third year in a row, life expectancy is going down. To put it another way, raise your hand if you have school-age kids. Those of you who raised your hands, we represent the first generation of parents in 50 years who can't look their kids in the eye right now and say, you're going to live a longer life than what I'm going to live. And one of the biggest reasons for that, suicide has now popped into the top 10 in terms of causes of death. Overdoses, as you all know, is a leading cause of death. These deaths of despair, in many cases, start with a common pathway. Unrecognized, untreated trauma, mental health issues that are, again, unrecognized and untreated, that then lead into self-medication with an array of products. And we've got to remember, it could be alcohol, it could be nicotine, it could be marijuana, it could be an array of products, but ultimately then lead to people who aren't getting the help that they need to deal with their substance use disorder. So I want to say, first of all, congratulations to each and every one of you in this audience who is in recovery. Raise your hand if you're in recovery. Now, I also want to ask you to raise your hand if you're in recovery and leave it up. I'm going to ask you another question. Raise your hand if you smoked pot while you were under the age of 25.
More hands went up.
Hold on. I'm sorry, I got to do this show. Okay, put your hands down. I got to get this on tape. I'm Surgeon General Jerome Adams, and I'm here with a recovery audience, and I'm going to ask the audience here a question. Raise your hand if you're in recovery. All right, now, keep your hand up or raise your hand if you smoked marijuana before the age of 25. See how many hands stayed up? Almost every single one. It's critically important that we know that marijuana has unique impacts on the developing brain. It can prime your brain for addiction to other substances, and it is a common component of many folks' pathway to substance use disorder. Thank you all for that. Thank you for that. So my personal Twitter account is @JeromeAdamsMD. My official one is @Surgeon_General. I get more real on my personal account. Tweet this morning. I actually was describing my week. My week on Tuesday, my son actually called me from the bathroom at school and said, Dad, somebody's trying to sell me marijuana. What do I do? That's Tuesday. Wednesday, my brother went to court for crimes related to his drug use, trying to get into recovery. And his pathway started with unrecognized, untreated mental health issues that he self-medicated with marijuana and then went to a party and someone gave him a pill. And that rapidly led to heroin usage. So that was Tuesday and Wednesday. Thursday, I released a Surgeon General's advisory saying that pregnant women and young people should not be using marijuana. And everyone said I was fear-mongering. But this is my lived experience in addition to where the science is taking us. And I want you all to understand, this is not fear-mongering. I hope that whatever your feelings are on marijuana and adult usage, and I got some strong feelings about that too from a public health point of view, but I hope we can all agree that no young person, no pregnant woman should be using marijuana. And that's really what my advisory is all about. And Kevin mentioned this, and Wilson's up here too, and he's the expert in this. But marijuana, 1995, strains of marijuana tested were about 4% THC. And I'm speaking to a crowd that is very educated, but just so everyone's on the same page, THC is the component of marijuana that causes euphoria, causes intoxication, and causes most of the documented harmful effects of marijuana, including addiction. 4% in 1995. In 2014, the strains that were tested were up to 14%, 3 times as strong. That was in 2014. The average dispensary now is putting out marijuana that's in the 20% THC, so 5 times more potent than the strains that people think of when they think of marijuana. As I said yesterday, I'm still waiting for the memes to come out there, but folks are talking about it. They were talking about it on GMA, on Good Morning America, on CNN, on NPR. I said this yesterday. This ain't your mama's marijuana. It ain't your mama's marijuana. We're talking about 25% stronger THC content in the plant, or 5% stronger, 25% in the plant form. And then you look at oils, you look at waxes, you look at shatter, you look at people vaping this, and they can get 75, 80, 90% THC delivery to the brain. This is like the difference between me saying, I'm okay with you having a 12-ounce light beer or a glass of wine to go to sleep, and me saying that I'm okay with you drinking a pint of vodka every night to go to sleep. That's the difference in potency we're talking about here, and we really have to understand that as we're having a conversation about marijuana use, that we recognize that we're talking about a fundamentally different product that is particularly dangerous to the developing brain. And so, again, I don't want to take up too much time other than to tell you all, my brother, my uncle, many people in my family are walking the same path that you all have walked and that you're walking right now. I'm not some government talking head who's spouting reefer madness over and over again. I'm talking about my lived experience, my family's lived experience. I'm talking as a father whose kids genetically, because of my family, are at risk for addiction. I'm talking about the things that I would want any other parent to know if they wanted to protect their children. And I'm asking you all to help me, again, regardless of how you feel about adult use, regardless, to help me spread the word that no pregnant woman, no young person should be using this, especially potent marijuana that's out there, because our youth, their future, is too valuable. It is too valuable. We know that when youth use, that they are more likely to drop out of high school, that they've actually seen IQ declines in youth use, especially correlated with higher THC content, that emergency department admissions have gone up for adolescents for overdoses of marijuana, for psychosis. We know it increases your chance of schizophrenia. And we know that it increases social consequences. I don't want to get too far off the tangent on social justice, but I've been around the country, and in many communities, we're seeing that folks are patting themselves on the back for driving down adult arrest rates, but they're not paying attention to the fact, or not monitoring the fact that youth arrest rates are going up because marijuana use has been normalized. And in every state, it's still illegal if you're under the age of 18 to possess marijuana. So we're not really solving social justice issues, we're shifting social justice issues. And we're still seeing the disparities play out among young people. If you have racist policies, if you have bias, you're still going to have racist policies and bias even after you legalize. They're just shifting them down to 17 and 16 and 15-year-olds from older people. So we have to deal with the underlying root causes of discrimination when it comes to addressing social justice issues. And in every minority community of color across the United States, we've already got a liquor store and a smoke shop. I personally don't see how adding a marijuana dispensary is going to help solve the problems that those communities face. So please, for young people and for pregnant women, help me spread this message, and know that as Surgeon General of the United States, you've got no bigger advocate in Washington, D.C. than me for what you do each and every day. I'm praying that my brother gets into one of the recovery houses that you all help lift up. We know there's not enough recovery out there. Thank you. I ask that you pray for him and my family and keep doing what you're doing. There is not enough treatment. There is not enough recovery out there. We know this, and I am leaning into this issue. And for anyone who thinks that I'm taking my eye off the prize, no. I'm widening my aperture and seeing the big picture here. We got to stop using our rifle and picking off one part of the problem and then watching it pop up in another place. We've got to look at the big picture, and the big picture starts with prevention. And it leads into educating people about the importance of diagnosing and treating mental health issues. And it leads into a discussion about all the different pathways that people end up needing treatment. And then it involves getting people into treatment and making sure there's access to naloxone, because you can't get someone into treatment if they're dead. You need to make sure we continue to talk about naloxone. And then it goes into making sure that treatment is effective and evidence-based, and that medication-assisted treatment is available to more people. And then it leads into recovery, because you aren't magically fixed after 30 days of treatment. We got to help people understand that recovery is a lifetime. It is a lifetime, and it is a lifestyle, and it requires supports, and that we need to make sure people can transition successfully from using to treatment to a lifetime of recovery and having the social supports that they need to be able to get back and become productive and successful members of society and of their families again. So thank you for letting me riff a little bit. I hope you all were patient with me and understand that I'm passionate about these issues. I hope you can hear it. I hope you can feel it. I hope you understand that I'm not up here just spouting off because I want to demonize you all, or because I want to hurt people's access to marijuana. I'm here talking because I've lived it, I've seen it, and I want people to learn from your mistakes. I want people to learn from your successes. I want people to stop stigmatizing people with substance use disorder, no matter what their substance of choice is. And I want us to make sure our kids have the best chance at a successful future. So thanks again.
Thank you so much, Surgeon General. Great to see you. Thanks for coming. And we got two more speakers. We'll have Josh up next, and then Wes, and then I think we're going to need to open it up for questions from you all. So get your questions ready. Thanks.
All right. Someone got the short straw. Speak after Dr. Adams. I think that, yeah, this is going to come up here. I just want to say how much I appreciate the Surgeon General, and to point out that when he put out an advisory on naloxone, encouraging people to carry naloxone, had a big impact on naloxone and had a big impact on overdoses. And his use of the position has been really remarkable for public health. So my name is, I don't know if this is going to work here. Hold on. Can you see anything up here?
Yeah, there's like, press that bottom right.
Okay, here we go. Okay, so my name is Josh Sharfstein. I'm from Johns Hopkins. Good to see you. I'm a professor there. I am so appreciative of the chance to be here with you all, and have such deep respect for what you do every day to not only help yourselves, but really to help so many other people in the midst of this crisis. And I'm going to talk about new research on opioid addiction, the good news and the bad news. So I'm going to very briefly mention 6 studies that have been published in the last year that I thought you might be interested in. Let me just also say that at Johns Hopkins we have a special program called the American Health Initiative, where we give full scholarships plus $10,000 for people who want to study and get a Master's of Public Health degree in the field of addiction and violence and a few other fields. But if any of you are interested, you should go to americanhealth.jhu.edu, and all the information is there, and as well as email addresses for how you can find out about the requirements and that sort of thing. You do not have to move to Baltimore. You can do it from where you are. So if anybody here is interested, we'd love to have people involved in Oxford House's study with us at Johns Hopkins. It's americanhealth.jhu.edu. Okay. Real quick, I'm going to talk about 3 studies on treatment and 3 studies on harm reduction. First one on treatment was published in September 2019. It is not yet September 2019, but they released the study early. So this study, by some researchers at our school and elsewhere, showed that when people with opioid addiction were taking buprenorphine, not only helped them for their opioid addiction, but it actually improved care for other illnesses that they have, including seizures, depression, and other high cholesterol and other illnesses. So that as we have talked about the fact that people with addiction die of many conditions, including chronic illnesses, actually having good treatment helps them with those other illnesses, and they're less likely to die of seizures, depression, and other illnesses. But then there's some bad news, which is a study out of West Virginia showed that fewer than 1 in 10 people who had had a non-fatal overdose of opioids actually got treated with buprenorphine, fewer than 1 in 10. So 90% plus people are not getting medications that actually reduce their risk of death by 50% or more. Now, I'm not an addiction medicine doctor, I'm a pediatrician. My wife is an addiction medicine doctor. When we were in medical school, I thought she was going to be like, I said, boy, my girlfriend, she's like a saint. She's going to take care of patients, and all her patients are going to die. In fact, I thought that was hopeless. I thought it was hopeless. And I thought as a pediatrician, I'd be getting all kinds of presents from my patients, okay? Because I'd be such a great pediatrician. Well, you fast forward a few years, and parents are too busy to give presents to the pediatrician, or I wasn't that good a pediatrician. And my wife, helps people, supports them in treatment and recovery. She takes people, from the brink of death, from the brink of, from homelessness, from HIV. She helps them get into treatment. So many of her patients do so well on medications, not on medications. You come to our house around the holidays, and they are so appreciative of what she's done, and she gives so much back to them. She's on call for them all the time. And yet so few people have access to that kind of treatment in this country. So that is a recent finding that is not good news. Why is it that so few people are able to get medications? And there's another study that just came out about the news media coverage of medications and how often it is wrong. And it's often wrong because it fails to say that they're useful, that they reduce death by a huge amount, that they reduce the chance of dying of chronic illness, and it also more frequently sends the message that being on buprenorphine or methadone stably is a form of addiction. And it is not a form of addiction. Addiction requires use despite harmful consequences. It means someone's life is falling away from them. But when people are in treatment, even with medications, they're getting their life back. They're reconnecting with their family. They're living independently. They're living in congregate settings. They're doing what they want to do with their lives. They are not in the throes of addiction. They are in recovery and remission. And that misunderstanding about medications is very prevalent in the news media, and it keeps a lot of people from getting care that could save their lives. Now, three new studies on harm reduction. All these studies were published in the last 12 months. This is about naloxone. We heard about how naloxone, the Surgeon General, Narcan can save so many lives. But there was a recent study in Pennsylvania that was published that showed that more than half of the pharmacies in Pennsylvania did not carry naloxone at all. And not only that, only 64% of pharmacists knew that there was a standing order that people would just go in and get naloxone. And so a third of them didn't even know how to dispense it. So that is a huge risk, given how important it is to have a rescue medicine around if people are using drugs. So we still need to get the word out, even to pharmacies, about naloxone. Here's some more bad news. Syringe exchange programs are effective in reducing HIV and actually helping people get into treatment. So that's the good news part of syringe exchanges. Recently, there's a trend for syringe exchange programs to start medications and help transition people right into recovery, and that has been very successful for places like Burlington, Vermont. But other places are shutting down syringe exchange programs, largely because of misinformation, and they're doing it in a way that is very stigmatizing to the people who are using it. And in one syringe exchange program in Charleston, West Virginia, there was a research study that found that when they closed a syringe exchange, people started sharing syringes more and actually were much less likely to get HIV testing, which greatly increases the risk of an HIV outbreak. This is what one of the female participants said. "I'm so worried about contracting HIV, it's unreal. I've been tested 4 times this year. I know a couple of people that have HIV, and I'm afraid I'm going to contract it." And they had no way to get safe needles. And these individuals who are using drugs often want to stop. And they're trying to find a pathway to success, keeping them alive and healthy until they can do that, until they can make a connection with the peer. You know, that's really critical. And unfortunately, as syringe service programs shut down, people are put more in harm's way. Last one I'll just mention briefly, maybe a little bit of good news in the face of the fentanyl epidemic. As you know, fentanyl is that last line that is killing so many Americans more than any other opioid now. And it's increasingly contaminating cocaine and methamphetamine, so people are dying of fentanyl without even knowing that it's in the drugs that they're using. There is research that suggests that if you help people test the drugs, they are very interested in knowing whether it contains fentanyl, and that they may take steps to protect themselves. There's also research that having those testing strips is an opportunity to make a connection with someone. And even the act of starting to test their own drugs is a step on the path to getting into treatment and recovery. And 90% of people who use drugs intravenously were interested in testing. And the greatest interest was in people who had themselves overdosed or witnessed an overdose. So people are really interested in what they can do to keep alive until they're able to get into effective treatment. So those are my 6 updates, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Josh. And last but not least, we have Dr. Wesley Clark.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. This is, I think, my 15th Oxford House session, and it's always a pleasure. I want to talk about less about research per se and more about 42 CFR Part 2, substance abuse confidentiality. But before I start, I want you all to repeat after me, 263. 263. 263. 263. And I'll explain that shortly. But I also want to thank the women in the audience, particularly those who are concerned about the use of marijuana. The data show that pregnant women, once they know that they're pregnant, stop using marijuana substantially. So in 2018, the prevalence of marijuana use in the first trimester was 10.5%. By the second trimester, it dropped to 2.3%. By the third trimester, 1.7%. So the public health message is getting through to women. Now, of course, it should be 0, but the data do show the public health message is getting through, and women listen. I don't know about the men, but women listen. Key issue, you've heard speakers repeat over and over again about the importance of treatment. One of the things that encourages people to get in treatment is the ability to have your treatment records subject to your decision as to who gets it. That's changing. For the first time in history of the federal rules that protect you, 42 CFR Part 2 and the legislation, 42 USC 290DD, it took me a long time to be able to say that, the federal government wants to change that. So last week, they released 2 rules. One to overhaul 42 CFR Part 2 to liberalize the people who can have access to your information, and 2, what I call 263, because it is Section 263 of 42 CFR Part 2. But Section 263 is, for the first time, is saying that if you commit a serious crime that includes violence and child abuse and drug trafficking, the court can issue an order to go through your records. Now, historically, it says if you committed a violent crime and child abuse, the court could issue a record. Now they want to include drug trafficking. They don't define what drug trafficking is, So the question is, anybody here ever bought and sold marijuana or opiates or any other illegal drug? I'm not. So, by and large, a number of you were involved in drug trafficking. So you should be able to go to treatment and say, look, I want to stop drug trafficking because I need to clean up my act. Well, for the first time, the government is saying, well, we want to know who you are. Not only do we want to know who you are, but we want to know who your providers are and who your friends and relatives are. We want to know if you have committed a serious crime, drug trafficking, at or from a substance abuse treatment program. Now, these are notices of proposed rulemakings, and you have 30 days to respond to that. HHS believes that reverting to the previous language is necessary to reduce and deter drug trafficking. So the key issue is if we want to encourage people to go to treatment, what we should do is allow them to go to treatment and talk about the things that cause them to have a substance use problem. Associated with the change in 42 CFR Part 2, there's legislation. And to accompany that legislation, I have a letter from 22 states' attorneys general who favor getting rid of 42 CFR Part 2, substantially changing it. Now, does anybody know what a state's attorney general's job is? Anybody? What is it? Prosecution. Now, when they want to get into your personal records, what do you think their purpose is? My job is to prosecute offenders. It's illegal to use drugs. That makes you an offender. So I want to be able to find that information out. Now, when your personal information becomes subject to disclosure to anybody and everybody, they can find that information out. So, sort of the Miranda warning says you can, this is a rule against self-incrimination. Well, anything you can and say will be used against you. If we want people to go to treatment, what we're essentially doing with 42 CFR Part 2 is discouraging people from going to professional treatment, encouraging them to go to Oxford House, which is a good thing. 12-step program. To the extent that buprenorphine is helpful, we're changing the rules. And I encourage you to understand that my 5 minutes are up, but the most important thing is to be aware that we're moving away from the war on drugs to a war on patients. And that I find objectionable. If we want to deal with the epidemic of drugs, we have to deal with the people, we have to allow people to go into treatment and feel comfortable and safe. Again, Oxford House does that. And Wilson, Oxford House is more than just housing, it's recovery. And I think I'd like to stress that. And I know you mentioned that it's important for housing, and I agree with you, but the larger issue about Oxford House is it facilitates recovery. And it uses the proximity of people who are interested in recovery to achieve that. And it gives them the safe place to be there. So, back to the federal rule. The federal rules that you should be aware of is 263. Can I hear you say that? 263. Make sure you tell people 263. Not to support 263. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dr. Clark. Excellent. Well, thank you all the panel members for that little brief synopsis from everybody. Now, we've got about 15 minutes left. We have a floor mic here for your questions. So please come up and ask a question. If you'd like to just go to the mic and we can hear it, thank you. If you want to address the question to one of the panel, just say which panel member, or otherwise you can address it to everybody on the panel. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Charles. I'm a person in recovery. My question is about Suboxone, Subutex, methadone. I was given this inside of a inpatient detox, and on my way out, I was offered it to go to the doctor's clinic, and for a fee, he would continue to write me this prescription. My question about this is, why is this not considered addiction for profit? It's the same pharmaceutical companies that are making this, and my personal addiction, as a young man, I smoked marijuana and did cocaine. I got into a car accident, and a group of doctors said, "You need this," and overprescribed me Oxycontin, which led to a heroin addiction, which nearly killed me. I've been sober for a little bit over 2 years now. But because of the 12 steps through Alcoholics Anonymous and the recovery support system that I have in Oxford House, I declined the offer to go to this doctor's clinic and take this. I know that medically assisted treatment is a big deal right now within Oxford House, but right now is what I see is a group of doctors once again telling me, you need this. And it can be done without that, and I don't understand why we're pushing this and we're not saying we're going to do this for X amount of time and we're going to work with some sponsors and we're going to do these things instead of saying for the rest of your life we're going to keep you on this product, because A, it's expensive, and when Mr. Kelly spoke earlier, he said, well, without this we're saving $10,000 a person, we're saving millions of dollars a person. And when Mr. Surgeon General spoke up there, he said 30 years ago they told me opiates were okay, and now they're telling me that they're bad. How do we know 30 years from now somebody's not going to stand up there and say, hey, they told me, hey, they told me methadone was okay, Suboxone was okay, and now it's not.
Okay. Thank you for your question.
I think it's a great question. And it boils down to strength of recovery. If you have an incredibly... listen up. If you have an impressively good recovery and you're working the program and you're doing the 12 steps and you're doing commitments and you're participating actively, then that can be the means to the end. That can be the means to the recovery. Every person's an individual. We have to look at each person individually. And we have to consider each person's situation individually. But if you look at the general population, if you look at everybody with addictive disease, well, you guys know as well as I do, how many of them are as committed as all of you are? There's a good portion of them, if not the majority, who are not as committed, who are not participating every day, who come into my office, and when I say to them, are you going to the program? Are you working the program? Are you doing the steps? Tell me, oh, all that does is make me want to use. All I do, or they tell me I'm going to the meetings, when really what they mean is they're across the street. They looked over there was a meeting going on. Or they sat in back, they arrived late, they left early, they didn't talk to anyone, they never raised their hand, they never participated. These are the people who are coming into my office, and they represent the majority of folks who are trying to get into recovery. So when I'm working with them and I look at the general statistics, which are applying to the whole group, and the statistics tell me that their chances at living are going to double over everybody else if they stay on the medication, I'm going to promote medication in general. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to look at an individual and say, my God, you are working a good program. You're perfect for us to taper this medication off. That's fine. But for the general individual out there, what you went through, where you went through the detox program and they tried to insert you immediately into outpatient care that incorporated medication-assisted treatment, I think that's a pretty fair way to start. And I think it's a pretty fair way to continue for the majority of folks out there. It's not to say that applies to each of you individually, but it is saying in general the statistics bear that out.
Now, I think we've got about 5 minutes left, right?
Okay. My name is Liam. I'm from Oregon. Anybody here? Thank you. Anybody here have a vape? Anybody here have a vape on them? Anybody? Where's your vape? Hold it up for a sec. I just want to see. I want to ask more, Stu, for you, for what your opinion on vaping is compared to because nicotine kills people. So smoking is terrible. And I got off smoking, but I vape now. See, there goes my voice, all this smoking. But I vape now. So I just want to hear your guys' opinion on this. And
Well, I'm going to answer this from a research perspective. We haven't learned enough about vaping. Each device that you guys carry is different from one another. Does the device she carries work the same as yours? I don't know. How much nicotine does it deliver? I don't know, because there's almost no regulation of these products. So one of the things we're trying to do is increase the research on these to understand who they can benefit, because certainly helping somebody quit burned tobacco is a good thing. Okay. If the only way you can do that is through a vaporizing device, that seems a very fair trade-off. But we don't have enough research to know who it'll help, who it won't help. Are flavorings good for you? Well, probably some of them not so good. I really don't want red pepper flavoring being inhaled into my lungs. I'm not sure that gummy bear or orange flavors are so good for teenager onset of these things. So there's a lot of things we need to learn about these devices.
what do you say, safer than smoking at this point?
It certainly looks like something that is essentially a steam product and has 2 or 3 chemicals in it is a lot safer than a burned product. But not everybody makes that full transition. Some people use it as a crutch to keep smoking longer term. So it's a pretty complicated issue.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. All right, we got a few minutes left. Yeah.
My name is Luke, and I am a addict. My name is Luke, and I'm from Newton, Kansas. I'm an addict in recovery. I was an opiate addict for 4.5 years, and it almost took my life. My question is for the gentleman over here on the far right. Have you yourself personally ever taken methadone? No? How can you push a substance that has a chemical dependency with it? Despite if a person works a program, that drug will create a chemical dependency. I know it firsthand.
All right. So the question is, first of all, let me back up. I don't prescribe methadone, but I'll answer the question. All of these substances that we talk about in here, marijuana, cocaine, methadone, Suboxone, Vicodin, Percocet, all of them, carry with them the potential of a physiologic dependence. In other words, if I take the drug on a regular basis each day and then suddenly stop, I'm going to experience withdrawal symptoms. If I take it each day, I will find gradually over the course of the first few weeks that if I'm taking the same dose, that the effects of the drug gradually diminish to some point where they end up at a baseline. So that's typical. Remember that what we're doing with providing Suboxone or providing methadone is, and I'm going to say this to probably your surprise, we are replacing one drug with another.
We're not surprised.
But remember that what we're doing, all of us, when you start addictive substance use, you are starting it because you are treating an underlying condition, the discomfort that you had originally that led you to find that these drugs made you feel better. Because for everybody out there who used heroin and got hooked on it, there are also some people out there who used heroin and did not get hooked on it. What differentiates those people? The people who got hooked on it, they had addictive disease, but they had that before they used the drug. So when we're giving Suboxone or we're giving methadone, we're giving a drug to treat the underlying disease, the addictive disease, and we're doing it with a medication that is less likely to cause harm and is less likely to lead to morbidity and mortality than the drugs that the person had previously chosen to use to treat how they felt.
Okay, thank you for the question. One more question.
Hi, I'm Chelsea. I'm from San Antonio, Texas. My mom was in a bad car accident, and she was like low income, so she got Medicaid, and her doctors prescribed her Vicodin, and towards the end of her life, doctors and Medicaid didn't want to fund or pay for her Vicodin, so she resorted to heroin. And what are we going to do whenever Medicaid stops paying for Vicodin or oxycodone or people who are in severe pain? And you don't have to answer this question. I wasn't able to get into treatment until CPS got into my life. And I want to know if you ask for help from doctors, would they report you to CPS like you would get punished for asking for help?
Indeed, you do, and that's one of the problems. In fact, in 6 states now, the moment you are pregnant, any substance use makes you reportable. So, in fact, it discourages pregnant women from going into treatment. So, this is part of the problem. People are using treatment as a way to identify people who use, and that's not a good thing.
This is also where a lot of these questions, but especially this last one, so thank you for bringing it up, is where we really need your voices here in Washington, D.C. and in your state capitals. This may be controversial, don't take it the wrong way. You need to stop being anonymous. I don't mean it in a way of, I don't mean that you need to out, your fellow, meeting members when you're in public, when you go to the bakery. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about your voices collectively, because all of the things that we're talking about here, most of the things we've brought up, the great things that Dr. Clark and Dr. Gitlow and others have brought up, these are underlying issues that lawmakers have no clue about. I just, having worked for a couple of them, and I'm not being partisan because I worked for both parties, they have no clue about it. They're dealing with 100 other issues. Their staffers do not have a lot of time about this. Unless this is not a front page in their local paper, they really could care less if it's not a campaign issue that they have to run on every 2 years. They're not experts on it. You all are, and the people on this panel are. And we need your voices out there. You need to write your legislators. You need to show up in their district offices. Because right now, the impression basically is that half of Congress thinks that most people don't need health care and Medicaid provided, that addiction treatment should, maybe it should be involved, maybe it shouldn't. It took our country 150 years to realize that the brain was an actual part of the body. In other words, health care was not just physical health care if you break your elbow, but things going on up here. And it took a long time because we were anonymous about it. We need your voices. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we are out of time, but I do want to honor these last questions. Could you just say who you are and ask your question? We won't have time to answer, unfortunately, but at least they'll give you a chance to answer them. We can think about those questions as well. Thank you.
My name's Eric. I'm a heroin and meth addict of 20 years. I got clean without any medically assisted treatment or anything. I just asked you guys, it's not even a question, it's asking from you guys. You guys really need to reach out beyond yourselves and talk to the people in the field who are actually out there. Because I've heard buprenorphine and marijuana get talked about. I heard marijuana described as this horrible thing when it's been known to treat cancer and treat a lot of things. And then buprenorphine be redefined as not an addiction process, not an addictive drug, which we all know is bullshit. And the only difference between the two is you guys don't control the marijuana industry, but you do control the buprenorphine industry. That's the difference that I see.
Okay, thank you for the comment. Next.
When it comes to the mental health issues, I've noticed a growing number of people that were being misdiagnosed, and mostly as bipolar, and they're being given prescription medications that make them, at the beginning, crazier than they were in the first place. And then once they become accustomed to the medication, they appear normal to us. How do we change that and reduce the number of misdiagnoses and increase the educational part through parenting and through our school systems so that people know not to look for the things that are wrong, but to help change them?
Thank you for the question. Thank you. Good question. Next. Yeah.
I'm an alcoholic named Art Moore, and I first raised my hand after Dr. Compton had spoke, and I was going to thank him for his remarks, but then I was going to remark that I had heard him use the word drug and opioid and numerous other words in that category ever so many times. And opioids had never once threatened and I believe I can speak for Mr. Malloy as well, threatened our lives. Bourbon whiskey threatened our lives. And it was never mentioned. And I may be answering my question, is it because there is NIAA and your institute does strictly focus on drugs? If not, why is there not
I'll be happy
a
to talk to you
remark
after.
about alcohol?
Great, thanks for the question, thank you. Last one.
Hey, I'm Colleen. How you doing? So I think that Oxford houses in general are a great opportunity to educate. And I don't know why we don't have people that come and teach us how to use naloxone, make sure that our naloxone or that our Narcan rather isn't expired, making sure we have enough in the house, getting everyone certified to know how to use it. I think that would be really beneficial. I also think, like, I haven't received a survey being here, and I hear a lot of statistics about drug addicts and alcohol, abusers. Well, I am one of those people, and I've never signed up for a survey. I've never been handed an anonymous survey, and we have 1,700 people right here. Why don't we have a survey that's asking us those same questions so we can be part of the statistics that we hear every time we come to these things?
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for all the questions, thank you for coming. Let's thank the panel also. Thanks a lot, have a great conference.